Private Novak's right boot snagged in the knotted roots of a fake hedgerow, and he nearly lost his balance, heart hiccuping as the squad's line shifted to avoid trampling him. Sergeant Hines's voice, muffled only slightly by the glistening mesh of leaves above, found its mark with stinging clarity. "Eyes up, Novak. You get your head buried. You're fertilizer. You want to be fertilizer." Novak shook his head. His helmet jostled forward and almost slipped over his eyebrows. Sweat trickled past the rim, mingling instantly with the constant film of cold rain. His left hand, already raw from 3 hours of crawling and awkward prone firing, gripped the slick wood of his M1 as if it were a drowning man's branch. Water ran off the stock in beating rivulets, and when Novak thumbed the safety, his hand trembled enough to slap the trigger guard. He tried not to look up at the sergeant, tried to ignore the ripple of glances from the rest of 3rd Squad. Instead, he focused on the hedgerow's sodden base, each clump of wire and root black with rain, the mud below oozing around his knees like bread dough. Farther down the hedgerow, a stubby conifer loomed. Its lowest limbs weighed heavy with water and the scent of crushed needles. Novak inhaled and caught mold and compost and the acrid edge of wet cordite from the last round of blanks. Across the little clearing, Lieutenant O'Connell stood rigid and immaculate, a faint ghost in the rain and drizzle. The LT's boots were new, soles barely scuffed, but the rest of him dripped like a man who'd long ago given up on dryness. He clutched a spiral notebook in both hands, white knuckles visible even from a dozen yards off. The notebook looked out of place, a scrap of order in the swampy chaos. O'Connell's eyes swept the squad from under the brim of his cap, pupils flicking with a rhythm that told Novak he was already running down the list of infractions for the AAR. In Novak's peripheral vision, the squad heaved forward again, rifles tucked at ready, boots squelching with every step. Sergeant Hines's whistle cut the air in short, cruel bursts. Advance, cover, drop, hold, until each man found his next patch of cover. Novak dragged himself forward on elbows and toes, wincing at the grating bite of gravel through his uniform's threadbare knees. He kept his rifle canted away from the mud as best he could, but the barrel still picked up streaks of wet earth. Just ahead, Private Torres slithered into a hollow and signaled Novak with a jerk of his helmet. The two pressed tight behind the heap of brush, nearly nose to nose. Torres's breath steamed in the chill. "You think Hines gets off on this?" he whispered, so low Novak felt it more than heard it. "Could be worse," Novak muttered, glancing back to see if the sergeant was in earshot. "Could be real Krauts shooting at us." Torres's mouth tugged sideways in a nervous grin. "You seen his bayonet? That's worse." From the hedgerow, the order came. "Line up on me, 5 meters, muzzles low. O'Connell, get your men in line, damn it." Hines's voice rose over the patter of rain, demanding both obedience and the impossible. Novak scrambled to his feet. His ankle rolled in a rut, and he caught himself just before he toppled. The radio antenna strapped to his pack swung wide and snagged a branch, nearly yanking him backward. In front, Torres ducked reflexively, and the man behind Novak barked a curse as the antenna whacked him in the face. Lieutenant O'Connell moved down the line, his notebook close to his chest like a shield. "Discipline," he murmured as he passed each man. "Don't let the weather beat you before the enemy does." His tone was so mild it grated, but it stuck with Novak, ringing in his ears as he adjusted the rifle sling and forced his spine straight. When Hines came up, he smacked the antenna with 2 fingers. "You gonna flag the whole squad with that, Novak? Control your whip or I'll rip it off myself." "Yes, Sergeant." "Check your safety." "Already did, Sergeant." Hines eyed him with something like suspicion, or maybe it was expectation. "You're the radio man. That makes you the brains of this operation. Don't act like a thumb." Then he moved on. The rain thickened for a while, coming at a slant now, sharp and needling. The field became a slurry, every step an act of extraction. Novak's boots grew heavier, and his shoulders burned under the radio's pack straps, each adjustment only grinding the canvas harder against his collarbones. His blisters throbbed. He flexed his left hand and felt skin separate from the meat below. He wondered if Torres's hands hurt too, or if Torres was just better at ignoring it. From the rear, Private Reed coughed hard enough to draw a glance from O'Connell, who scribbled something in the notebook without missing stride. Up front, Hines led the line parallel to the mock hedgerow, occasionally stooping to check the fake booby traps or set a new tripwire for the next unit. The squad moved, stopped, and moved again, their formation a lurching centipede. Novak hated the stop-start worst of all. Each pause gave the cold a chance to get under his skin, into the places sweat had left raw. "Platoon, down!" Hines barked. The whole squad dropped in a staggered line along the hedgerow, Novak's belly slapping into a fresh puddle. He felt water seep up instantly, soaking through to his undershirt. The radio's handset dug into his ribs. He fought the urge to retch. A second later, blank rounds cracked out, the air filling with the toothless pop, pop, pop of a simulated firefight. The noise wasn't much, but it had the effect of focusing every nerve. Novak counted rounds, a habit he'd picked up from somewhere, and tracked the positions of the other squads by the flicker of muzzle flashes, little dandelion blooms of light, gone as quickly as they came. Across the field, another platoon huddled behind a stone wall made of sandbags and chicken wire. He could make out the hunched backs and the frantic signs of their own sergeant, some poor bastard whose voice was already raw from shouting. Then came the counterattack. Reed, acting as point, bellowed, "Contact left," and the squad pivoted toward a cluster of wooden targets painted in dull gray. Novak aimed, squeezed the trigger, felt the rifle's blunt recoil shudder up his arms. The blanks made the action cycle sluggish, but he worked the bolt like it was second nature. Torres was already firing, shouting, "Reload!" before Novak even finished his first magazine. The targets didn't fall. They weren't meant to. But Novak watched his lines discipline with a weird sense of pride. No one flagged their neighbor. Every shot was controlled. O'Connell paced behind them, notebook forgotten, lips moving silently as he counted and judged. When the last blank shell pinged off the mud, Hines blew his whistle twice. Cease fire, reload, assess. Novak fumbled with the spare magazine pouch, his fingers numb and fat from cold. The plastic catch stuck, and he had to bite the tongue of the clasp to get it free. He caught Torres watching and braced for a joke, but Torres only nodded and got back to his own reload. The rain tapered, leaving only the hiss of wet wind in the hedges and the distant click of metal on metal as the men rearmed. O'Connell crouched beside Novak, shielding a cigarette from the elements with one palm. He offered it, and Novak took it with a mumbled thanks. The first drag hit with a violent head rush. "Don't let Hines catch you smoking," the lieutenant said, eyes forward. "I won't, sir." "Good. You're doing better with the comms. Keep the antenna tight, though. You don't want to draw fire." O'Connell looked sidelong at him. "And keep the jokes down. Hines thinks it's weakness." Novak wanted to laugh, but the smoke made him cough instead. "He's probably right, sir." "Doesn't matter." O'Connell ground the cigarette out in the mud and stood up, brushing his hands clean. "He's got his job. We've got ours." The rest of the exercise blurred into a wet, shivering crawl and walk through the hedgerow, each move shadowed by Hines's relentless corrections. By the time the whistle sounded for index, Novak's boots were sodden sponges, his uniform painted with mud from thighs to chin. The men gathered in a loose circle around the sergeant for debrief, each careful not to touch anyone else, as if misery were contagious. Hines paced in front of them, hands behind his back. "You want the honest version or the fairy tale?" No one spoke. "The honest version. You all move like you've got anchors up your ass. You cover your sectors, and you can shoot okay, but you forget you're a unit the moment you hit mud. That's what gets you dead, not the krauts, the mud, and your own goddamn brains." He made eye contact with Novak, then with Torres, then with Reed. "But you're learning. O'Connell says you're better than first platoon already. That's not saying much, but it's a start. Hydrate, dry your kit, and be back at the arms room in 30. I want those rifles clean enough to eat off." Dismissed. The squad broke, some limping, some shuffling. Novak was slower than the rest, unwilling to leave the cold wet behind because he knew the barracks would be worse, dry, but rank with mildew and the sweat of 100 bodies. He fell in with Torres, who had already unbuttoned his jacket and wrung out a sleeve. "You want to be the first to shower, or you want to drink the last of the coffee?" Torres asked. "Coffee," Novak said. "Always coffee." The trudge back to camp was uphill, both ways. The field's soft earth sucked at every step, and with the rain stopped, the sudden absence of noise made the men's breathing seem impossibly loud. Novak's pack, lighter now but still clinging to him, pulled at his shoulders until he wanted to scream. The world tasted of mud and iron and defeat. As they crossed the threshold of the barracks, Torres let out a low whistle. "You ever think about the guys that get to fly the planes?" "Sometimes," Novak said, staring at his boots, the treads packed with wet loam. "But I bet they still have to clean them after." The pair peeled off, Torres toward the showers, Novak in search of the canteen. At some point, someone had started the pot, and the coffee inside was thick, black, and too hot to drink. Novak wrapped his fingers around the mug anyway, letting the pain from the heat cut through all the others. He stood alone for a long moment, the wet uniform clinging to his ribs, and watched the drip of water from his helmet onto the concrete. He wondered if the real Normandy would be wetter than this, or if after enough rain and mud, even hell felt routine. The arms room was barely big enough for a dozen men at once, but all of 3rd Squad packed in there after exercises, shedding their rain-sodden jackets on the hooks near the door. The floor was painted concrete, worn smooth by 1,000 boot soles and pocked with old oil stains. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead, bleaching out all color but the yellow-gray of fatigue. Novak shouldered his rifle gently onto the nearest wooden bench, careful not to ding the sight post. The room echoed with the metallic clatter of disassembly, bolts, pins, and barrel bands scattering across tabletops as the squad field stripped their rifles. The air was thick with the tang of hops and the sweet rot of damp uniforms, a scent Novak now associated with home more than any place he'd ever lived. He unscrewed the receiver and pried the bolt free, his thumbprint smearing black across the action. The cleaning rag was already dark with old fouling, but he worked it into the bore anyway, twisting until the patch emerged, streaked with gray. The tip of his little finger caught on the sharp edge of the chamber, and a crescent of blood welled before vanishing into the gun oil. Down the bench, Torres had already reassembled his weapon. He spun it once to check for loose pins, then propped it upright and stretched. "You ought to ask Hines if he can get us gloves," Torres said. "I'm sick of losing half my hands to these springs." "Write your congressman," Novak said, then coughed, voice hoarse from the smoke and rain. He dabbed the fresh cut with the corner of the rag. "Maybe he'll send you a manicure kit." Torres snorted and nudged Novak with his elbow. "You're just mad because I beat you here." "Only because you skipped the debrief." "Debrief is for officers." Novak grinned, but the expression faded as Sergeant Hines's reflection loomed in the room's grimy side window. A moment later, the real Hines entered, wiping his palms on a folded cloth. He walked the benches, inspecting each man's progress with the gaze of a man who trusted no one, not even himself. "Reed, that barrel looks like a sewer pipe." "Try again," Hines said, barely pausing. Reed muttered and set back to scrubbing. Hines's shadow fell over Novak and Torres. "You boys know why you're doing this?" Hines didn't wait for an answer. "It's not for my health. It's because this piece of metal is all that's between you and an early grave. It stops working. You stop working." He picked up Novak's M1, sighted down the barrel, then ran a thumb along the receiver's groove. "Cleaner than last time, not by much. Don't half-ass the patchwork, Novak, or you'll be eating sand and death." "Yes, Sergeant," Novak said, feeling his throat tighten. He waited until Hines moved on, then dipped the rag into the cup of solvent again, the sharpness of it clearing his nose and sinuses in one violent rush. He threaded the cleaning rod through the barrel, taking care not to let it scrape, and tried to lose himself in the repetitive motion. Each time the patch emerged, a little cleaner, he felt the tension ease until he reached the bolt carrier. His hands were cold and clumsy, The spring assembly skittered once, twice, and on the third try he lost the grip entirely, and the snap ring shot across the room, pinging off the window. The men at the next bench broke into muffled laughter, but Torres just shook his head and fetched the part, setting it quietly in front of Novak. "Don't sweat it," Torres said under his breath. "First time I did this, I lost a pin in Heinz's coffee. He drank it anyway." Novak fumbled the carrier back into place, but something wasn't lining up. He could feel the tension was wrong. He forced it once, and the mechanism froze. He pulled it apart, palms now slick with both oil and sweat, and tried again. The laughter from the next bench shifted to half-mocking advice. "Try your left hand, Novak. Maybe it's upside down." He felt his face burn, but he clamped his jaw and focused. Out of nowhere, someone slid onto the bench beside him. It was Private Jenkins, older than most of them by at least a decade, a man whose hands looked built for machining tools or fixing cars. Jenkins said nothing. He just reached over, repositioned Novak's right thumb, and guided the carrier forward. The part clicked in place, easy as breathing. Novak let out a slow, grateful exhale. "Nothing wrong with asking," Jenkins said, voice barely above a mumble. "Everyone needs help the first 100 times." "Thanks," Novak said, and meant it. They finished the cleaning in a quiet rhythm, Jenkins occasionally glancing over, but never correcting again. The room's noise faded to a low murmur, every man now bent over his own work. Novak wiped his hands on a fresh rag and ran one last check of the action, savoring the dry, confident click of the mechanism. It was as good as it would ever be. Sergeant Hines circled back for inspection. He picked up Novak's rifle, ran the bolt, peered down the sight, and set it back on the bench with a sharp nod. "That's how it's supposed to look. Remember that tomorrow." Novak squared his shoulders, pride edging out the exhaustion. "Yes, Sergeant." "Stow it in the rack and get chow. Double time." The squad filed out, boots squeaking against the damp floor, the air already clearing as the gun oil smell faded. Novak caught Jenkins's eye on the way out, and Jenkins just nodded once, the gesture enough. In the corridor, the men let the tension drain out, stretching, joking, jostling each other. Novak's hands still tingled, but it was a good burn, proof he was learning, and maybe proof that he'd get through this after all. He looked back once at the arms room, the benches and rags and scattered parts, and realized the place already felt familiar in a way that stuck to the skin. He wondered, as he moved toward the mess hall, if this was what real soldiers felt. Not the glory or terror, but the constant, unremarkable ache of getting things right, one small part at a time. The mess line coiled around the corridor, every man in Third Squad pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breaths raising a vapor that fogged the wire-reinforced glass. Novak shuffled along at the rear, eyes fixed on the back of Corporal Davies's neck, where a strip of hair had grown in wild after the last barracks haircut. Each step forward brought the kitchen's animal scent closer, fat and lard and something metallic, like blood or pennies. Ahead, the line bottlenecked at the serving hatch. The mess corporal, a spindly kid who looked barely out of high school, ladled stew into battered tin bowls with the accuracy of an assembly line. Today's ration was little more than water the color of rust, broken by blobs of sweet and cubes of carrot. When Novak's turn came, the corporal sized him up and gave an extra shake of stew, letting a single grayish chunk of beef tumble onto the mound of potatoes. "Special for you, Novak," the mess corporal said, smirking. "Don't spoil me," Novak replied. He grabbed a slice of white bread, already stiff at the edges, and followed the line to the nearest table. Davies slid into the seat opposite, tray loaded with an extra hunk of bread. "You gotta know how to talk to people," Davies said, tearing off a bite. "Smile at them, they smile back. Simple math." "Pretty sure he spit in mine," Novak said. Davies shrugged, chewing. "Adds flavor." Across the table, Torres picked at his stew with his fingers, fishing out the largest carrot cube and holding it up like a trophy. "Anyone heard if they're cutting rations again?" he asked. "This looks thinner than yesterday." "Ask Hines," Davies said, nodding toward the next table over. "He'll say it's all in our heads." Novak didn't need to look. He could feel Sergeant Hines' presence, coiled and ready, a man who never ate sitting down if he could help it. Today, Hines was circling the tables, checking trays, making notes on a pad. Every time the room started to rise above a murmur, Hines's gaze brought the volume down again. Tin cutlery scraped, and the men ate in fast, mechanical bites, eyes darting up only to check if the next bowl would be any better. On the far side of the room, the scuttle of rumor was almost louder than the clatter. "Heard it's next week." "Nah, that's just to keep us from sleeping in." "My buddy in supply says they're stockpiling plasma and morphine. Shit's getting real." Novak soaked the bread in his stew, using it to sweep the last scraps of meat from the bowl. He tried not to listen, but the words stuck anyway. Next week, real. The anxiety floated above the table like a fog, only getting thicker as the meal went on. At the front of the room, Lieutenant O'Connell was hunched over a set of unfolded maps, a pencil clamped between his teeth. He'd arranged 3 chairs around the table, but no one else dared to join. He was studying, or maybe just waiting for orders. After a while, Torres leaned in. "You gonna write her tonight?" "Huh?" He nodded at Novak's jacket pocket, where a dog-eared envelope peeked out. "Letter for home. You always do it after chow." Novak said, "If I don't, she worries," and left it at that. He finished the last of the bread, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and made his way to a quiet corner of the mess hall, where a few battered tables were reserved for overflow. He took out the letter kit, paper, pencil stub, already addressed envelope, and stared at the blank page until the words surfaced. "Dear Anna, we're well here. The weather's been a little rough, but we're all holding up. I learned how to fix the radio by myself, and I think I'm getting better every day. The food is not what you'd call gourmet, but sometimes I can trade for extra bread if I'm lucky. Don't worry about me. I know what I'm doing, and I'll keep my head down. Love, John." He read it over, then added a P.S. "Tell Mom not to send anything else. There's no room in the pack. Tell her I said hi to Frankie for her." He folded the letter and pressed it flat, sliding it into the envelope and sealing it with one quick pass of his tongue. He didn't have to write the address. He'd memorized it weeks ago. He tucked the envelope into his breast pocket, where it would stay dry, even if the rest of him didn't. The mess hall began to empty, men filtering back to bunks or the smoking area by the laundry shed. Novak glanced back once at the tables, at Davies, still charming another round of bread, at Hines, still circling, still tallying up some invisible ledger, at O'Connell, who had moved from maps to a battered manual and was now sketching something in the margin. Torres joined him, slumping onto the bench. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," Novak said, pocketing the pencil. "You?" Torres shrugged. "You heard what they're saying." "I heard. They say some of us won't come back." Novak thought about the rifle, the way it felt when it finally fit together, the way the spring locked in, clean and perfect. "Someone's always saying that," he said. "We do the job, that's all." For a moment, neither spoke. Novak felt the steady, familiar weight of the letter in his pocket, a lifeline back to another world, or maybe just a record that he'd been here at all. Torres broke the silence. "If you get extra bread tomorrow, cut me in." Novak managed a tired smile. "I'll see what I can do." They sat together until the mess hall lights flickered and the world outside the windows went from gray to the black of oncoming night. The truck rattled down the graveled lane, its rear doors trembling with every rut. Novak stood with the rest of the squad, faces blank in the washed-out daylight as the engine's idle cut through the brittle morning. Medics in white armbands rushed the tailgate, popping the latch, their boots squelching in the puddled mud. Inside, the stretchers came out one after another, 6 in all, though the truck's floor could barely hold 4 side by side. Each man was swaddled in wool blankets, stained rust brown and yellow, their boots lashed together, faces slick with sweat or blood or both. The first had a bandage over his whole head, only the mouth and nose showing, and when he groaned, the sound was like a man trying to clear his throat underwater. The second was a kid, younger than Novak, arms splinted to a board, eyes wide and glassy as the medics set him gently on the wet earth. Novak tried not to look, but it was impossible not to. There was a parade of ruined flesh, a man with half a hand, a man with a cheekbone mashed so flat his eyes seemed to float loose in his head, a man who clung to his chest with both arms as if he was holding in his own heart. Every time a new stretcher passed, the air filled with the smells of sweat, iodine, and the sour funk of fear. The other squads lined up, silent and tight-lipped, as if to form a barrier between the wounded and the rest of camp. A medic barked, "Clear a path," and the crowd pressed back against the barracks wall. Sergeant Hines was already there, arms crossed, jaw working as he counted off each man. The last stretcher held a man from 2nd Platoon, eyes rimmed with red, his skin the color of old milk. As they rolled him by, the man's head lolled sideways, and he fixed Novak with a stare that seemed to burn through the bandage tape. He rasped, "The Krauts are waiting for you, boys." The words caught on his teeth, thick with spit and whatever drugs the medics had pumped in. Novak felt his chest cave in, sharp as a knee to the solar plexus, his hands balled into fists at his sides, fingernails digging into his own palms. The medics whisked the stretchers into the aid station, where the door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo. Hines stepped forward, calling the squads to attention. His voice was low, but carried over the mutter of the crowd. "Eyes front. What you just saw is what happens when you don't check your field of fire, when you get lazy, when you treat drills like a game." He turned, fixing each man in turn with a pointed glare. "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for them. I'm telling you that every one of you is one bad second away from joining them." He let the silence hang, then dismissed them to quarters. Novak walked back to the barracks with Torres, neither saying a word. The hallways were oddly quiet, even the usual locker slams and shouted insults dialed down to a hush. The air inside the room was thick, the windows fogged from the warmth of so many bodies crammed into so little space. He made straight for his bunk, ducking under the upper rack and sitting with his knees bent, boots planted firm on the floor. He reached into his kit bag, searching for something he'd kept hidden since the train ride to camp, a faded snapshot of his sister Julia from 2 summers ago. She was at a picnic, hair windblown, tongue out in a raspberry. Novak pressed his thumb over her face, then set the picture on his knee and stared. The barracks shifted around him. Some of the men played cards on the footlocker, but their voices were dull, the laughter false. Others just lay on their bunks, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Reed, the cougher, was writing a letter with his lips moving silently. Davies took a pencil and started a list of names on a scrap of ration paper, crossing out each one, slowly, with the eraser end. Torres finally broke the silence, voice pitched low. "You think that was us? The guys in the truck?" "Not yet," Novak said, too quick. "Then, maybe tomorrow." Torres nodded and lay back, arm over his eyes. Novak pulled out his letter kit and set it on the blanket next to Julia's photo. He clicked the pencil twice, then stared at the blank sheet. The lines blurred, and for a second he thought he'd cry. He didn't. He only started to write. "Hi, Julia. Tell Mom I'm still good. Don't tell her about the hospital or the men who came back all torn up. I know she worries, but I need her to believe I'm stronger than that. Today, we saw something bad. I won't say what, but it made everyone quiet for the whole night. I think I'll remember those faces for a long time. If you see Frankie, tell him I'm still smarter than him and to quit the football team if it gets in the way of his homework. Love you, little bird. John." He read it once, then folded the paper and slid it under the pillow. The words felt thin, like they might blow away with the first breeze, but they were all he had. He placed Julia's photo next to the letter and lay back, listening to the rhythm of the other men's breathing, the shuffle of cards, the muted tears someone tried to muffle 2 bunks down. The world outside was wet and gray, the next day already waiting for them. Novak closed his eyes and hoped that, for tonight, the Krauts would wait too. The dock was an afterthought. Planks warped and slick, hammered over sodden earth that gave way with every footfall. Novak stood with his back to the dark, the radio pack already biting into his shoulders. He cinched the canvas straps until his chest caged in, breath shallow and hard. Alongside, Torres adjusted his web belt, fiddling with the canteen cup so it wouldn't rattle. Everyone had some small ritual. Davy spat into the black water and watched the ripples. Reed traced a cross on the receiver of his rifle. The older guys just stood with their faces blank, letting the damp seep in. Novak tried to block out the talk. He focused on the things he could control, checking the handset was wired, the antenna collapsed, the spare batteries secure. His hands ran the drill with no room for thought, muscle memory beating out fear. The only light was a dull haze from the dock lamps and the moon, which kept hiding behind rags of cloud. The sea below was the color of melted steel. Sometimes, in the troughs between waves, you could hear the engines from the transport ships humming, or the distant cough of a big gun inland, too far off to mean anything yet. Sergeant Hines moved down the dock, boots thumping with authority. He wore a fatigue jacket that still carried yesterday's mud, and as he passed each man, he gave a nudge, a word, a nod. When he reached Novak, he paused, flicked a thumb over a clump of dried muck on the collar, and said, "You good, son?" Novak swallowed, feeling the rawness in his throat. "Yes, Sergeant." "Packed tight?" "Yes, Sergeant." Hines gave a final nod. "Don't let it slow you. If it does, you cut it loose. Better alive than a hero." Novak looked at the sergeant, trying to find any trace of nerves. There was nothing. Hines's jaw worked side to side, and his eyes never left the sea. At the end of the dock, a line of landing craft bobbed in the surf, snouts up, ropes creaking with every shift. Lieutenant O'Connell stood at the head of Third Squad, hand on the rail, silhouetted by the lamp behind him. The LT had that statue stillness Novak envied, his hair and collar unmoved by the wind, eyes locked on the blackness beyond the bow. One by one, the men filed past O'Connell, each touching the cold metal of the hull before climbing aboard. Novak's boots left muddy prints up the gangplank. Inside it was cramped, the air close and rank with old diesel and the ghosts of salt and oil. They sat on benches, knees pressed together, rifles between boots, packs jammed wherever they'd fit. The only sound was the slosh of water against the hull and the occasional clink as someone knocked an elbow on a steel edge. The engine started with a cough, then a roar that rattled Novak's teeth. He felt the vibration run up through his boots, through his spine, into his skull. O'Connell moved to the front of the craft and turned. He didn't speak, only held up a hand, 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The boat lurched backward, spun, then shot forward, spray smacking the men in the open air like slaps. Out on the water, everything changed. The dock and the land vanished behind them, swallowed by the fog and distance, and all that was left was the shudder of the engine, the slap of the waves, the row of men hunched under their helmets. Novak clung to the side rail, eyes fixed on the nape of the man in front of him. He told himself not to think, not to count the seconds, not to wonder what was waiting on the other side. But he did. He thought of Julia's letter, of the men in the hospital truck, of the kid with the splinted arm and the blood-caked hair. He thought of Hines's words, "Better alive than a hero," and wondered which he'd be, if given the choice. The first artillery burst was only a rumor, a faint glow on the horizon, no sound at all. The second came a minute later, a crack that rolled over the water like thunder. Reed jumped and swore. Davies grinned through his teeth. Torres only hunched his shoulders and stared. Novak felt his chest tighten, but it wasn't panic. It was a kind of acceptance, the realization that everything that mattered was already set in motion. The sea surged beneath them, and the boat sped up. O'Connell's silhouette was a dark slash against the brighter sky, his stance unmoving as the world bucked and rocked around him. Hines crouched near the engine cover, eyes narrowed, watching for something none of them could see. As the shoreline came into view, just a line of black teeth on the water, flickers of firefly light where shells hit, the men stopped fidgeting. Novak could feel the unity, the way fear made them a single thing, not just a crowd of strangers but a living body with one heart. He pulled his helmet low, checked his pack again, and waited for the ramp to drop. In that moment, with the spray freezing his cheeks and the sound of the engines filling his ears, Novak thought of home. Not the kitchen table or the backyard, but the memory of his sister's laughter, the way it sounded in the summer when the world was safe and nothing was waiting to kill you. He gripped the rail until his fingers hurt, and when the first real shell exploded close enough to send a pulse through the hull, He didn't flinch. He just braced himself, shoulders squared, ready to run the gauntlet. The night cracked open ahead, and the boat surged forward. Novak followed.